What's that? Oh, you want to criticize another pioneer in psychology? Yeah, we can do that. How about this guy? All right, so we're going to ask the resident teenager for their impression.
It looks like if you took his glasses off, his nose would come off with it. It looks like he was molded from clay, but like poorly. Like a wax candle that was put on a really hot windowsill and is halfway through melting. It looks like his hair was, no, half his hair looks natural. This part just looks like his cat, like a cat when they lick their kitten and it, like, you know, gets on their face. Yeah, he looks like he's wearing a suit made out of paper, like a little boy who's trying on his dad's clothes. Yeah, his name's Skinner.
Skinner!
Looks like his,
Have you ever heard of B.F. Skinner before?
Yeah, looks like he has both too much skin and way too little. No.
Do you know anything about his legacy and what he did?
No clue.
All right. Well, let's start there. All right, so this guy is B.F. Skinner. B.F. stands for Burris Frederick. So what is he known for? He's one of those guys that if you've ever taken a psychology class, it is very likely that he would have come up somewhere in there. And so he is one of the big names in behaviorism. I've already previously talked about John Watson, and Skinner's kind of like the other really big name in behaviorism. In behaviorism, the focus is on what's happening in the environment to influence or cause or determine behavior, with very, very little emphasis or acknowledgement or recognition, certainly no study of what's going on internally. And so what are the criticisms of his approach? So you have articles like this that say why B.F. Skinner may have been the most dangerous psychologist ever. A pretty common criticism is that he had a very deterministic view of behavior, meaning that we were kind of like puppets being controlled by environmental factors like consequences of behavior. He focused a lot on reinforcement and punishment in shaping behavior. And people said that he discounted free will. In fact, I had a professor who very strongly believed that pretty much anything that we would try to explain in any kind of sort of fancy, poetic way, things like attachment. And we've talked previously about Harry Harlow, you know, attachment between an infant or child and their caregiver. And my professor would say reinforcement history can explain attachment. You know, other things as complicated as love and relationships. He'd say, but we can break it down into reinforcement. And I've had one professor who say, well, maybe free will is an illusion in the sense that our reinforcement history combined with our genetic predispositions makes us think we have free will, you know. So ideas like that are certainly going around. One area where Skinner got a lot of criticism was in his ideas about language development. Usually when I teach about language development in undergraduate human development courses, when we get to childhood language development, there's often this section about the different major theories, major perspectives about how and why humans learn to use spoken language, which is fairly unique in the way that we communicate. And they often start with Skinner. Skinner would say, well, you learn language because you make noises and people around you, like your parents, reinforce you for making those noises. You say da, 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 and they say it again, and eventually they reinforce you enough that you start saying da, da, you know, when this male parental figure is around, things like that. And another perspective that often gets attention is, well, there are also social factors leading us to use language to get our needs met. But another big name theorist in language development is Noam Chomsky. And my green screen picture back here, my screen grab, is cut off, but this is a very influential article called The Case Against B.F. Skinner. And he criticized Skinner's ideas as being too deterministic, too focused on environmental factors. Chomsky actually had another sometimes discredited idea, or certainly, well, one key aspect of it has been discredited. He talked about us having innate tendencies to learn language. He even talked about there being a universal language acquisition device in the brain. Neuroimaging studies, which were not nearly as advanced at the time. Neuroimaging studies really haven't found like a part of the brain that would be equivalent to a language acquisition device. And really language theorists now, they say, well, really language is complicated. A lot of human behavior is complicated, and things that Skinner would have proposed for explaining behavior, it's not necessarily that they're wrong, but they're not everything. They're not the whole picture. Sometimes Skinner gets some flack for his reliance on animal studies. I mean, behaviorists in general. In fact, when I started telling my resident teenager about some of the stuff that Skinner did, they said, oh yeah, what's it with all these early psychologists wanting to do all these things with rats? You know, it used to be a very common way to do things. I mean, one of the things that's easier to get rats, they show up on time for their studies. They don't lie. You know, ethically, you can do more with rats than you can do with humans. He didn't just work with rats, but some of his well-known studies did involve rats, and he is known for coming up with this operant conditioning chamber, which people often will call a Skinner box. And this is a chamber that's like a little mini laboratory, a controlled setting. That's what a laboratory is, where you can control things like reinforcement and punishment. So reinforcement, the rat does something like push a lever. They can get reinforcement in the form of food, or if they do something you're trying to extinguish, trying to get them to stop doing, you can punish it by using this electric grid. And I know some people don't like this. Hey, I don't do these studies, but you know, they were done. And he also did work with other species. Most notably, he did do some work with pigeons. And here we have a pigeon where they could peck a certain part of the operant chamber to give their response. Now, one myth that's out there that sometimes students will ask me about, they'll say, is it true that Skinner raised his daughter in a Skinner box? I even had a professor, this would have been like 1999, I had a professor in my master's program who said it like it was fact, like it was true. Yeah, did you know he raised his daughter in a Skinner box? That's not true. So the basis of this is based on his own child rearing experiences with his first baby. He realized that there were certain things that could be easier for parents. And so he came up with this invention called an air crib, which I've also seen referred to as a baby tender. And the thing is, it was introduced in an article where the title was Baby in a Box. So that is probably where the association with the Skinner box comes from. And I mean, it makes it sound like, hey, you don't put a baby in a box. I mean, so the wording of that article probably has a huge influence on how this invention was perceived. And the big idea with this air crib was it was supposed to be a temperature controlled environment that made things easier for the parents by having like a glass panel that could be lowered so you didn't have to bend over the crib to get your baby. You could just lower the glass and take them out. And when you really look at what this thing was for and what it did, it's really not as controversial as it often is depicted because of all the myth around it. Essentially, it was like, a convenience sort of device. There was no electric grid. There was no lever that the baby had to press. They were not reinforcing the baby through it or anything like that. It was supposed to be a crib that was more convenient for parents. All right, so the legacy of Skinner, emphasis on environmental determinants of behavior, which sometimes leads to an oversimplified view that that's all that can explain behavior. Like, why is this child acting this way? Well, let's go blame their parents and figure out what they did to make the child act that way. And sometimes you definitely do see that when people trying to explain child behavior and looking at parenting. Of course, we now know, modern psychological researchers know from lots of evidence that most things are complicated. You can explain them in terms of operant conditioning, which is what he called this reinforcement and punishment relationships. You can explain them that way, but there are other things at play. Like with a child has their own temperament. They have their own genetic predispositions. They have their own motivations. They have their own emotions. They have their own physical pain and whatnot that can contribute to their behavior in a given moment. So it's not so much that he was wrong, just that, well, he presented part of the picture.